Economic Legitimation in a New Era. Public Attitudes About State Ownership and Market Regulation. A paper by Sarah Eaton and Riza Hazmath. Section 1. Introduction. A growing literature on authoritarian resilience and resurgence emphasizes the importance of strong economic performance in generating popular support for autocrats. But what precisely constitutes strong economic performance in the minds of citizens living in autocracies? And how do processes of social and economic transformations shape judgment of the state's economic performances? Past research from China and the post-Soviet world suggests that relying on economic growth and expanding household incomes alone is not a viable legitimation strategy for the long run. This is partly because citizens' implicit benchmarks for evaluating autocrats' economic performance are themselves in flux. Public opinion of economic affairs is shaped by belief systems that shift with underlying changes in material circumstances. Processes of ideological and value pluralization that attend economic development can often lead to the emergence of new expectations of the state in its economic functions. In particular, growing affluence may generate increased demand for relatively meritocratic and impartial inclusive economic institutions and a rejection of extractive institutions that channel particularistic benefits to regime insiders and supporters. Our article contributes to the study of authoritarian legitimation in China by examining citizens' views of two critical economic roles of the state beyond growth promotion, state ownership and market regulation, that shape citizens' overall impressions of the state's economic performance. While scholars have previously analyzed public perceptions of the state's economic performances most directly tied to individual material well-being, growth, and redistribution, including public goods provision, public attitudes towards these other functions of the Chinese state have yet to be carefully studied. Since both the propriety of state ownership and suitable models of market regulation have stirred passionate debate among policy elites in China, we focus on these policy domains and examine the extent to which expert critiques of the so-called China model resonate in wider society. Based on an original survey conducted in 2015 and 2016 in 6 Chinese cities, we find that Chinese citizens have a sophisticated and, on some issues, quite critical view of the state's economic performances in the domains of regulation and ownership. Our results show, first, that there is a high degree of implicit agreement within China about what economic roles the government ought to perform. Most respondents express support for an interventionist state that takes an active role in shaping market outcomes. However, there is a concurrent desire for these interventions to be inclusive, such that market players close to the state, especially state-owned enterprises, SOEs, do not benefit improperly. Further, respondents' evaluations of actual economic performances suggests that the state is not always meeting expectations, and this is particularly apparent in public opinion regarding competition policy and pollution control. Finally, statistical analysis shows that young people are, on the whole, both more doubtful about the state's highly interventionist stance in the economy and more likely to see it carrying out its duties poorly. This last finding raises questions about the efficacy of the state's legitimation efforts vis-à-vis urban youth in the coming years. Section 2. Economic Legitimation and Authoritarian Resilience. An overriding point to emerge from the recent surge in research on authoritarian systems is that autocracies are held together by much more than coercion and repression. Autocrats employ sophisticated means of managing competitive tensions between political elites, and they strive to secure regime stability by generating a degree of popular support for themselves. Within that former category, the use of economic growth promotion and redistribution to produce popular autocracies is especially prominent. Indeed, research on legitimation strategies employed by post-Soviet non-democracies find that among a wide range of legitimating claims, including reference to foundational myths, ideology, personalism, international engagement, rule-based procedures, and economic performance, rulers are most likely to present themselves as guardians of citizens' socio-economic well-being. The People's Republic of China is arguably the world's best example of such economically populist authoritarianism. While some might assume that the increasingly harsh repression of a widening circle of perceived opponents of the state, artists, lawyers, dissidents, activists, journalists, liberal university professors, and ethnic minorities in Tibet and Xinjiang, would weaken public support for the CCP within China, most available evidence does not support this view. The World Values Surveys have consistently shown that Chinese citizens have among the highest rates of confidence in their government in the world. The most recent data finds that fully 85% of Chinese respondents report a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the government, and this finding of broad public support is supported by a variety of survey-based academic research. It bears noting, however, that preference falsification likely inflates these figures to some degree. One commonly finds the claim, in both scholarly and popular discussion, that public backing for China's one-party rule is based first and foremost on the state's ability to deliver goods in economic terms. Yet, economic growth is an inherently shaky foundation of authoritarian stability. First, the occurrence of an economic crisis can be extremely destabilizing if it serves to alter citizens' perceptions of the costs and benefits of authoritarian rule, leading to popular uprising and/or engendering divisions within the ruling elite. In China's market reform period, effective macroeconomic management has kept the nation from falling into deep economic crisis at several critical junctures. But it has now entered a period of secular slower growth and is struggling to steer around the middle income trap. An open question regarding this new normal is whether a prolonged economic slowdown in China, even if it follows a slow and gradual curve, could ultimately threaten the CCP's authoritarian survival. Further, quite apart from the vagaries of markets, autocrats who base their authoritarian legitimation strategies on economic growth may ultimately wind up as victims of their own success. Processes of social transformation that attend rapid economic development typically lead to shifts in the public expectations of the state in the marketplace. Whereas citizens of pre-industrial and industrializing societies tend to be supportive of a highly interventionist role for the state in the economy, in line with survival values that emphasize deference to state authority, individuals in post-industrial societies are typically more circumspect about state interventions in the economy, in keeping with dominant self-expression values emphasizing personal freedom, as well as fairness and tolerance in society. Thus, while robust economic growth may have been a strong anchor of authoritarian legitimation in the early stages of China's reform-era economic development, citizens now accustomed to a higher base of economic well-being feasibly hold more complex expectations of the state. Further, demand for inclusive institutions may conflict with the authoritarian survival imperatives, since autocrats use economic levers to reward regime loyalists. Contours of economic legitimation in China's new era. Judging by debate within Chinese policy circles regarding which economic roles the state should rightfully assume and which activities should instead be left to autonomous market forces, evaluations of the Chinese state's economic performance are increasingly in the eye of the beholder. In the early days of market reform, a powerful growth consensus meant that economic success was nearly synonymous with GDP growth. Today, China's leaders face a much longer and more challenging list of policy priorities. some of which stand in tension with one another. In addition to maintaining economic growth and steering around the middle income trap, policymakers simultaneously aim to reverse a grave environmental crisis without depressing growth, push China up the value chain, carefully liberalize the capital account, draw down local government debt, rein in industrial overcapacity, and increase social security and healthcare outlays, among other urgent policy challenges. In these vastly more complex circumstances, what are the state's economic performances that count in the eyes of Chinese citizens? The impression that growth is no longer sufficient to generate a high degree of public consent for one-party rule is supported by recent research on Chinese scholars' discussion of legitimacy. An analysis of academic articles on the topic of state legitimacy in China from 2002 to 2007 found that half of all authors mentioned economic growth as a crucial component of a legitimation strategy, while over one-third stressed the importance of social equality. A follow-up study examining the discourse from 2008 to 2012 found that just 21% of scholars saw economic growth as the key to the state's preserving the right to rule. Scholars continuously warned about the fleeting nature of performance legitimacy and the necessity of establishing more solid legitimacy foundations, especially rational legal legitimacy. The author concludes that it is a near consensus that the state should find sources of legitimacy other than economic performance. Furthermore, Chinese scholars deemed changing values, along with socioeconomic inequality, to be the major threats to legitimacy, each of which was cited in almost half of the articles. If growth is no longer enough to persuade citizens of the CCP's right to rule, which economic functions of the state do citizens care most about? Previous research has also shed light to this question. Based on a nationwide survey, one study finds that citizens place relatively more weight on the state's provision of pure public goods, public security, public safety, and legal order, than they do on economic growth in their evaluations of the government's trustworthiness. Another study suggests that the quality of economic governance is key. Citizens' judgment about the fairness of institutional arrangements are of primary importance in shaping their overall impressions of economic performance. Relatedly, recent literature identifying an ideological spectrum in China would suggest that the particular economic roles the public demands from the state vary somewhat according to individuals' economic beliefs. The ideological spectrum divides between, on one end, individuals who hold authoritarian traditional non-market values, in other words, those who support authoritarian rule, traditional values, and a high degree of state intervention in the economy, and on the other, those who embrace liberal non-traditional market values, and who favor political liberalization, oppose traditional socio-cultural norms, and support market-oriented policies. Driven in part by shifting values and ideologies, Chinese citizens' perception of the state's economic performance appear to become increasingly varied, nuanced, and critical. It would seem that growth alone is no longer sufficient to secure favorable impressions of the state's economic performance. This is especially the case for those who have grown up in a relatively secure economic period. Younger generations increasingly expect the state to extend the benefits of growth to all more deftly and also improve the fairness of market outcomes. In the remainder of the paper, we substantiate this claim through the analysis of Chinese citizens' views of two critical duties of the sovereign state ownership and market regulation. Section 3. Methodology. To study citizens' attitudes towards the state's economic performance beyond growth and redistribution, we conducted a pilot online study in the summer of 2014 and followed up with a random digit dialing telephone survey that ran from late 2015 to early 2016. We targeted urban residents, aged 21 and above, located in 6 cities corresponding to varying levels of socioeconomic development and tiers: Beijing and Shanghai, Tier 1, Chengdu, Hefei, Hohhot, and Wuhan, Tier 2. Our sample size was 1,025 respondents, with a sampling scale of 131,291 persons and involving 68,162 telephone numbers. The demographics of our survey sample and that of urban residents from the 2010 census are fairly close. Our survey employed a 7-point Likert scale to measure the strength of respondents' agreement or disagreement with queries. This analysis focuses on responses to 10 question blocks relating to state ownership, competition policy, industrial policy, macroeconomic management, and environmental protection. Section 4. Perceptions of State Ownership. In order to provide a detailed picture of public perceptions of state ownership in China, the survey includes queries on a range of issues regarding the economic performance of SOEs, as well as the institutional environment encompassing state ownership. The data reveals that Chinese citizens are somewhat favorably disposed to the idea of state ownership, with 58% of respondents expressing some degree of agreement with the statement, sectors related to national security and important to the national economy and people's livelihoods must be controlled by SOEs. There is interesting demographic variation within the data. Statistically, significant differences across age categories for this question reveal that young respondents, 21 to 30, in our sample, all of whom belong to the one-child generation born after 1980, are significantly less likely to express firm support for state control of key sectors. Support for state ownership increases stepwise in the older age cohorts and is especially pronounced among the oldest participants, 51 and over, who all belong to the Cultural Revolution generation. While a large proportion of Chinese citizens express support for the idea of state ownership of the commanding heights, in principle, responses to other questions suggest a degree of latent dissatisfaction with the actual practice of state ownership in certain key sectors. In particular, there appears to be no strong consensus about what sectors of the economy ought to fall under state ownership, a topic that has stirred considerable controversy in recent years. Our data provides a detailed look at public opinion towards state ownership of a group of SOE-dominated industries, including defense, the power grid, petroleum and petrochemicals, telecommunications, coal, civil aviation, and shipping. Defense was the only industry for which a large majority of respondents, 68%, agreed that state ownership should predominate. Aggregate support for state ownership of power was 56%, 53% for petroleum and petrochemicals, 52% for coal, 51% for civil aviation, and 50% for shipping. Notably, less than half of respondents agreed that state ownership should predominate in telecommunications, while 36% disagreed. China's telecommunications industry has been deeply embroiled in the anti-corruption campaign under the leadership of Xi Jinping, and these doubts about state ownership of telecom possibly reflect, in part, the public impact of these scandals. A higher degree of negative effect regarding state ownership of telecommunications may also reflect respondents' misgivings about state monitoring and censorship of internet and mobile communications, as well as the popular view that mobile telecommunications costs are unacceptably high due to the state's monopoly. Regarding perceptions of the economic performance and competitiveness of SOEs, we find a curious discrepancy. While respondents express reservations about the capabilities of SOE managers, they convey much more faith in SOE products. Responses to the prompt, "State-owned enterprises are well run," show a divided base of opinion, with 38% agreeing and 37% disagreeing. Firms of every other ownership type ranked above SOEs on this measure. Consistent with other findings relating to perceptions of state ownership, younger respondents are significantly more likely to view SOE management critically. Interestingly, the general pattern is reversed when we look at respondents' confidence in the goods and services of firms of different ownership type. Almost two-thirds of respondents, 66%, express confidence in SOE products. There are also statistically significant differences across age categories in responses to the query about SOE products, with younger respondents as well as men viewing them more critically. How is it that large numbers of respondents perceive SOE management as poor, but not their products? The perception of SOEs as prone to corruption, more below, and inherently inefficient due to the soft budget constraint, is plausibly shaping respondents' views on this issue. Respondents may, for example, be relatively satisfied with the electricity supply they receive from the state-run power company, and simultaneously perceive it as poorly run because the cost per unit produced is perceived to be too high. While the benefits of SOE employment have been steadily rolled back in the market reform era, respondents continue to see employment in the state sector in a positive light. 57% of respondents agree that employees are typically well treated in SOEs, and only FIEs were evaluated more highly in this category. Respondents' positive impressions of SOE employment are consistent, may reflect a shift in the preferences of university-educated job seekers toward state firms in the years following the global financial crisis and the beginning of China's economic cool-down. Analysts speculate that FIEs and private firms' post-crisis struggles made the lure of stable employment in SOEs attractive enough to offset the perceived downsides of SOE employment, low pay and frequently unrewarding work. China's slowing economy likely adds to the appeal of SOE employment, relative to firms more vulnerable to the ups and downs of markets. Consistent with this view, that changing economic circumstances has made SOE employment appear more positive to young people, there are no statistically significant differences across age categories in responses to the query on SOE employment treatment. The data reveals a strong linkage between state ownership and corruption in the minds of respondents. More than two-thirds of respondents, 69%, report that among firms of different ownership type operating in China, corruption was a major problem in SOEs. On the one hand, this strong association in the minds of respondents between SOEs and corruption is surprising, given that the official ideology has long sung the praises of state ownership and emphasized the indispensability of SOEs to the national economy. On the other hand, it is not unexpected when set against the background of a parade of corruption scandals in recent years, many of which involve SOE leaders. Indeed, the timing of the survey coincided with the busiest phase of the recent anti-corruption campaign, when a new SOE general manager was being placed under investigation virtually every week. Section 5. Perceptions of Market Regulation. The survey produced rich data on many aspects of the state's various interventions in the economy under the banner of market regulation. We collected a range of information exploring respondents' expectations with regard to the state's duties in policing and guiding markets, specifically about the degree to which there is public demand for competition policy, industrial policy, Keynesian macroeconomic management, and managing pollution. The data also allows us to compare citizens' expectations of the state against their judgments of actual performance. Competition policy. Our data led insight into citizens' views of the role of the state in providing a level playing field between firms. Here we observe a significant gap between citizens' expectations of the state in carrying out this role and their assessments of the state's actual performance. With regard to expectations, a large majority of respondents see the state as having a responsibility to regulate markets to ensure fair competition between firms. More than three-quarters of those surveyed, 77%, agree with this statement,
and within this cohort, half strongly agree. However, respondents' expectations are evidently not always being met in actual practice of market regulation. When prompted to evaluate the state's performance in ensuring fair competition between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, more respondents disagreed, 43%, that the state is doing a good job than agreed, 40%. This finding resonates with debate among scholars and policy experts regarding the advance of the state, retreat of the private sector after the global financial crisis, and up to the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, when the government was criticized by liberal economists for dispersing stimulus funds largely through state-owned firms and sanctioning heavy-handed takeovers of private firms by central SOEs. Lending further support to the view that younger Chinese tend to hold more pro-market views, there are statistically significant differences between age categories in responses to this question, with younger respondents significantly more likely to evaluate the state's performance critically. Macroeconomic management. While many respondents view the state as lacking impartiality in the domain of competition policy, respondents were, on the whole, quite positive about the state's role as manager of economic crisis. Responses to two questions show that most citizens are highly supportive of interventionist measures in times of significant economic stress. Nearly 80% of the respondents expressed implicit support for Keynesian crisis management approaches, in agreeing that it is the state's responsibility to stimulate the economy during an economic crisis. A large majority, 71%, further believed that there are key enterprises where state-owned or privately owned that are too big or important to fail, notably during an economic crisis. Moreover, there is strong alignment between the expectations of the state and perceptions of its actual performance as crisis manager. Echoing widespread praise of China's macroeconomic management during the global financial crisis, 71% of respondents agreed that the state effectively managed China's domestic economy from the recent global economic crisis. Industrial policy. The broad support for the interventionist measures extends to the expected role of the state in nurturing domestic firms through industrial policy. The vast majority of respondents believe that the state has a duty to support Chinese firms in their efforts to become global players. 87% of respondents agreed that it is important for the state to develop and encourage a group of globally competitive large enterprises to compete in global markets. This aligns with the finding of strong nationalist sentiment about Chinese firms going out into overseas markets. Together, the two results suggest that a vast majority of people expect the government to play the role of developmental state. Further, they also see China's developmental state functioning well. Managing negative externalities. Another dimension of the state's regulatory role, managing pollution, reveals a pronounced disconnect between respondents' expectations of the state and their perception of actual performance. There appears to be a consensus within China that the state should prioritize environmental protection, even when it involves painful trade-offs. In response to the prompt, it is the state's responsibility to protect the natural environment, even when doing so could harm economic growth. 86% of the sample agreed, with 57% strongly agreeing. This belief is aligned with some official policy which has steadily increased the prioritization of energy savings, emission reduction, and most notably, improving air quality in recent years as part of a wide-ranging war on pollution. While it is widely agreed that there have been tangible improvements to environmental governance in China, the remaining gaps between official policy and actual outcomes continues to generate controversy. In analysis of who bears the blame for this green implementation gap, local governments are most often seen as the culprits, since problems of local protectionism of polluting firms and lax enforcement of environmental regulations abound. When asked about the state's performance In the area of environmental protection, respondents tend to be critical, and are especially so of local governments. Consistent with the widely held view that the essential failings of China's environmental system emanate from the bottom of the administrative hierarchy, respondents perceive the central level as performing the tasks of environmental protection best. 60% of respondents agreed with the statement that the state at the central level does a good job of protecting the natural environment. However, younger people, along with residents of Beijing and Shanghai, are significantly less enthusiastic in their assessments. Relatively positive appraisal of the center contrasts sharply with views of local governments. Less than half of respondents, 46%, agree that provinces are doing a good job of environmental protection. A note of caution is due in interpretation of this data. However, since recent dramatic improvements in air quality in China's urban coastal areas, above all in the Qingjin-Ji region, Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei province, may have already generated more positive judgments of the state's environmental performance in targeted urban areas since the time of our survey. Section 6. Discussion. Our results suggest that the Chinese public expect the state not only to perform a wide range of functions in the marketplace beyond growth promotion, but also to carry out these duties fairly. While in the responses convey a general demand for inclusive market institutions, respondents' evaluations of actual performance point to perceptions that state interventions are sometimes extractive in their results. This is especially evident in citizens' evaluations of state ownership, which can be differentiated between two things. First, the actual business and products of SOEs, which most respondents see in generally positive terms, and second, the institutional environment surrounding state ownership, which elicit more skeptical appraisals. While the results convey a strong support for the notion of public ownership overall, younger people in particular are significantly less supportive of SOE monopolies and oligopolies in key sectors of the economy. And more specific prompts about what exactly the state should own elicit more critical views from all respondents. Survey questions that evoke the non-market privileges that accrue to SOEs in China's state capitalist system also generate critical viewpoints. As a whole, the data suggests that not all citizens are convinced of the government's oft-repeated rationales for retaining the state's controlling force of the economy through large SOEs, particularly central-level firms. Similarly, our findings on the state's regulatory functions reveal both points of agreement between Chinese citizens' expectations and evaluations of the state, but also disconnects. In the former category, we find the crisis management and industrial policy functions. A large majority of citizens expect the state to intervene in markets to ward off economic crisis and to give domestic firms a leg up in global competition. They also perceive the state to be performing these developmental state functions well. Yet, significant gaps between expectations and evaluations of actual practice are evident in respondents' opinion of competition policy and environmental protection. In each case, large majorities agree that the state has a responsibility to carry out these duties, but they see much room for improvement in actual practice. The data on competition policy echo the findings on state ownership, regarding concern about the extractive characteristics of market outcomes when the state serves as both player and referee. The significance of age in shaping judgments about state ownership and regulatory functions warrants special comment. Our results echo findings in recent studies exploring the impact of age and generational effects on views of market reform and political attitudes in China. Critical attitudes towards one of the most contentious issues in contemporary China, privatization, increase with age in nearly a linear, monotonic fashion, with younger people exhibiting significantly stronger pro-market orientations than older cohorts. An analysis of political attitudes based on survey data collected in 2008 finds that the one-child generation, born 1980 and later, show a greater openness to considering deviations from the political, governmental status quo, in addition to a willingness to criticize and to consider change. Our results highlighting the strength of pro-market orientations, as well as critical assessments of the practice of state ownership and regulation among the youngest respondents, all of whom belong to the one-child generation, are consistent with Harmel and Ye's conclusions. As well, previous work on the strength of socialist views of economic issues within the Cultural Revolution generation, particularly among former sent-down youth, helps to contextualize the sharp upswing in support for state ownership among the older respondents aged 51 and above. While our analysis sheds new light on citizens' views of key economic roles of the state, beyond growth promotion, future studies on this topic could focus on refining this picture. A particular shortcoming of our dataset is the absence of rural respondents, and future work should sample opinion from both cities and the countryside. With regard to the possible effects of rural-urban location on perceptions of the state's economic performance, a working hypothesis is that rural respondents are less critical of state performance in the areas of market regulation and ownership. Moreover, given the significant gaps in healthcare and education outcomes between rural and urban China, rural respondents are conceivably more concerned about the quality of public goods provisions. Another line of inquiry would incorporate respondents' ideology into the analysis. One would respect respondents ascribing to a liberal, non-traditional market ideology to be relatively more concerned with the fairness of state ownership and market regulation practices, but perhaps less attuned to distributional matters. Respondents with an authoritarian traditional non-market ideology are less critical of state performance overall, but relatively more concerned about the fairness of market outcomes and express higher demand for social policy in order to reduce inequality. Finally, future inquiry could analyze the relative importance that citizens attach to growth promotion, public goods provision, ownership functions, and market regulation to discern the state's economic function that contribute most and least to the state's legitimation. Section 7. Conclusion. While these data reveal a baseline of support for China's economic performances in the ownership and regulation categories overall, there are also indications of dissatisfaction with the extractive features of China's state capitalist system. We submit that the critical edge of public opinion revealed in our analysis may be a sign of diminishing political returns to a growth-based authoritarian legitimation strategy. While the extreme hardships and suffering of the Maoist period provided fertile ground for a reformist leadership intent on renewing its right to rule on the basis of improving the people's livelihood, the greatest transformation that followed has brought with it rolling social change and the emergence of new values and ideologies. This is especially true of the younger generations, whose views are somewhat at odds with China's state-led approach to capitalist development. Increasingly, citizens, notably younger cohorts, expect the state to provide a level playing field whereby the firms that succeed in market competition accomplish this on a basis of their merits and not their connections. What some see is a state that unfairly backs poorly run, corrupt SOEs against a non-state sector superior in management capability, efficiency, and dynamicism. They believe that a state should stand up for environmental protection and bring an end to a growth at all costs. What some see are officials providing cover to industry and turning a blind eye to hazardous levels of water, air, and soil pollution. In short, growth alone appears no longer sufficient to sustain positive views of the state's economic performances. If this trend continues to the extent of threatening authoritarian stability, the lessons learned from post-Soviet states is that the state will devote more resources to maintaining their rule and less attention to governance issues. Herein lies a dilemma for the Communist Party. Accommodating demands for inclusive market institutions would entail deep economic reforms of the sort that would effectively dismantle state capitalism. Yet doing so could irreparably damage party patronage networks and possibly even destabilize one-party rule. We surmise that Xi Jinping's administration has decided to forego deep economic reform, a policy option that appeared very much on the table at the beginning of Xi's tenure, in favor of shifting their weight to a legitimation strategy that focuses on, first, reducing inequality through poverty alleviation measures and social policy investments, second, addressing citizens' concerns about environmental crisis and health hazardous pollution, and third, cultivating personalist and populist appeals based on the purposive framing of Xi Jinping as a charismatic leader, on par with the great helmsman Mao Zedong. Our analysis might suggest that this legitimation strategy will have only limited appeal for many younger citizens. As the older generation of dyed-in-the-wool CCP supporters begin to recede from the political equation, the CCP may well find legitimation work vis-à-vis the new generation of urban elites a more arduous task.